Welcome to the Shepherds Network podcast, a podcast from Abundant Life Church located in Syracuse, New York. In this podcast, we'll explore the heart, the soul, and the spirit of what it means to be a minister. In this podcast, you'll hear conversations with different leaders, from industry experts, stories from other shepherds, and insights from ministers to equip you with the practical and the spiritual principles you need to thrive on your ministry journey. Thanks again for joining us today. Let's dive into today's episode.
Welcome to the Shepherds Podcast. It is great to have you with us today. The Shepherds Podcast is designed by shepherds for shepherds and the unique challenge of pastoral leadership. So if you are a shepherd, and when I say that, you know, if you're a leader and I say, are you a shepherd? If you're a pastor, you know what that means. It resonates with you. If you are a pastoral leader, then you are a shepherd and you have some unique opportunities, challenges, and supernatural supply that is available to you in the work that God's called you to do. So this podcast is dedicated to you and to help pastors and their pastoral teams become the very best they can be in this very dynamic and changing world that we're living in today. And today we're going to talk about different kinds of pastors, different kinds of shepherds that we see that, and I think you'll find yourself or maybe your pastor in this discussion. We're also going to talk a little bit about different kinds of churches that exist, because not all churches have the same mission. Not all churches have the same calling or DNA. While we all share the common values of Christ and his word and wanting to reach the world and grow the believer, every church has a unique way in which that is expressed. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And we're going to find that even in the diversity, you may have a church that's geared one way with a pastor that's geared a different way. And that means that you have strengths, but you're also missing some things. And so when we're missing some things, how do we bring those other elements into our ministry to make sure that we're not just strong in our strengths, but we're covering the full base, the whole counsel of God's word, and that we're creating churches that are really holistically a blessing to our communities. And with me today for this conversation is my very dear friend, a member of my board here at Abundant Life Church, and a longtime mentor. He was one of my very first teachers when I was in Bible college in 1984 and became my favorite professor in Bible college. He went on to become the dean of the school and now travels and is a leadership consultant and speaker all over the world. Tony Cooke and Tony Cooke Ministries. And Tony, I want to welcome you. It is great to have you on the Shepherds Podcast.
Thank you, Pastor John. And you're one of my favorite students of all time. You were just a wee lad, when you were in Bible school. So
That's right.
just appreciate you, John. Appreciate your leadership and what you and Lisa, the wonderful church you've built along with your team there in East Syracuse.
So Tony, how have you been? What have you seen happening? You know, we're maybe a year post-COVID, year and a half. What do you see as you travel and you interact with pastors, shepherds, and churches?
Yeah, Pastor John, we just see a great diversity. People seem to be coming out of rebound mode, although I think probably a large percentage would say they're still recovering, they're still rebounding. I think there was a lot of restructuring that happened as a result of the COVID situation. And I think it really helped churches. I know the negativity of the whole thing, but if we're going to look at a positive angle, it helped churches differentiate between mission and methods.
Yeah.
A lot of churches found they really had the mission. I don't believe the mission never changes, but the methodologies do, and the tools, and working with people when they're in personal upheaval and when they are confused and when they are torn by many voices and things of that nature. It really was a shaking.
It was.
uh, like Hebrews talks about, everything will be shaken that can be shaken, and that which cannot be shaken will remain. But I
Right.
think it was a real time of sifting for churches, and it was a really good opportunity to ask ourselves the questions: what are we doing that we're supposed to be doing? And what have we been doing that we've just been doing it because we've always done it? And it was a time where, many different types of programs went away and maybe never came back, maybe never will come back. But I think it caused churches to dig down, find out what their real core values are, and find out the best methods to carry that out into this post COVID era.
And every church was unique because depending on the state that you were in, your period of closing was different. And
Very.
also, I think one of the things that was most challenging is we had a moment where there was a conflict of biblical values. What I mean by that is, there's this very strong ethical value in the New Testament in Romans 13 and First Peter, I think it's chapter 3 and 4, where the Bible says, honor the governing authorities, submit to the authorities that govern and talking about secular authority, for all authority that exists is appointed by God. And if you resist the authority, you're resisting the order of God. And Paul wrote that to the Romans when Nero was either in power or about to be empowered, and he was a wicked man. And there was nothing righteous or godly about Rome. And yet Paul said the Christian ethic is to honor governmental authority. Even if the person isn't saved, the office is something God established. And then, of course, Peter says the same thing. He says, fear God, honor the king. If you're going to be criticized, don't let it be because you're meddling in the other people's affairs. So we have this value of honoring government, and then at the same time we had this other value: do not forsake the assembling of yourselves together, as a manner of some is, right, in the book of Hebrews. So we're supposed to gather, and yet we have a situation where it's really difficult to gather without endangering people, especially when the pandemic and certain strains of that virus were going around. And then you have government authority trying to figure out what to do to keep the people safe. And then you had politics that got involved. It was very complicated.
Mhm. Yeah.
We were closed for over a year for open public services because we were trying to honor our state government's mandates, and we were walking in that Romans 13 principle. And the way I could resolve it was to say, well, Bible says don't forsake the assembling of yourselves together. So if we're not going to assemble physically, we can assemble digitally. So we went really hard into digital ministry, and so that is a kind of assembly. And I think as I look back on it, I think I would have tried to get our people together sooner with masking and distancing and all of that in place. But again, we were trying to really follow the state line. So every church, what I'm saying is every church in every region had their own unique set of challenges. And it was
Mhm.
kind of like, uh, we've got to figure it out. And I think it was confusing for the sheep. It was confusing for pastors. And the pastors I talked to reflect very much what you just said, that it's a new world. It's different. A lot of the people who were the key volunteers in the church prior to COVID, people typically 40 and older, many of them are still attending online and have not come back to church. And if they are coming back, they're not serving. So most of the churches have a whole bunch of new people in the church,
That
but the
is
new
true.
people are not taught or trained and don't have the same, let's say, Christian work ethic when it comes to volunteerism in the church. It hasn't been
Mhm.
developed in them yet. So churches tend to be understaffed in their volunteer ministries, and uh, and they're trying to figure out how to move forward. And I think a lot of churches are figuring it out. And there's a lot of churches that have been suffering as well. So it's an interesting season, and it's a really important time for us to talk about what does the church need right now from its shepherds. And as shepherds, pastors, What do we do now to bring the very best kind of leadership to the church? What does our church need in this season?
Mhm. John, everything you said is so helpful to think through the process. And I have uh, just so you know, I've been traveling full time for 21 years, and we've been in 47 states. We've been in 31 nations, and we're interacting pretty much on a daily basis with pastors from all kinds of, this past weekend, I was in a church of, well, it's in a town of 1,957 people, a very rural community in Nebraska. Well, a couple months ago, I was in Los Angeles area. And so we see all kinds of churches, all kinds of pastors. And the one thing that has really struck me, Pastor John, over the years is just diversity and they're a unity base foundation, but diversity within that unity. And I look at the animal kingdom, and I look at the colors, and I look at the flowers, and there's nothing monochromatic about God.
Right.
And he can take different people, different personalities, just even study the difference. For example, in a few weeks, John, I'm going to be in Cyprus, and I'm going to go to the place. I know you love these things, but I'm going to go to the place where Paul and Barnabas first step foot on the island of
Mm.
Cyprus. And then we're going to go to the other end of the island and be at the ancient harbor where they stepped off of the island of
Mm.
Cyprus.
Without John Mark.
Yes, that was John Mark's journey. He went with them north to Turkey, and then after that, he was
He
done.
took off. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but just to look at Paul and Barnabas, they are two. They're wired so differently. Paul, especially early in his ministry, was extremely task oriented. He was driven. He was a mission oriented leader. And Barnabas was a relational leader.
Very much.
And, so, people always ask this question. To me, it's a great case study on who was right, Paul or Barnabas. And, because Mark abandoned them. And then when they wanted to go on their second mission journey, Barnabas wanted to bring Mark and give him a second chance, very true to his encouragement. Barnabas wasn't even his name. His name was Joseph, but he was given the name Barnabas because that name, it's a nickname, means son of encouragement.
Yeah.
And he always believed in the underdog. He had done that for Paul.
Right.
He was always
Yep.
encouraging and lifting.
He'd
Paul,
he'd find the underutilized person, bring them close, and help them define their passion and vision. And
yeah,
his joy was in doing that, seeing them flourish.
Yeah, and he was a nurturer. And I think Paul later became more that way, but I think especially early on, not being willing to give John Mark a second chance. And yet later we see Paul mellowing, and at 2 Timothy chapter 4, the very last epistle Paul ever writes, he tells Timothy, get Mark and bring him with you because he's profitable to me for the ministry.
Yes.
And so Barnabas was a nurturer by nature. Paul learned to be more nurturing over time, but Paul was a missional leader. I
Right.
think one of his favorite verses might have been, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Paul was that pioneer,
Yep.
and it affected, and he probably had to have that kind of personality
Yeah.
for what his assignment was.
So this is really interesting because we're recognizing that God calls ministers who have different personalities to different kinds of assignments,
Yeah.
and invariably they have different styles of leadership. So I want to lean into that. And you and I have talked about this, and I want to talk about these four kinds of shepherds,
Yeah.
four kinds of shepherding leaders. Now, this is based on not only my conversations with you, my own observations, your observations as well, but also some things that we've studied outside. And it's really interesting how pastors tend to fall into one of these four categories as
Mhm.
a primary motivation and often have a secondary motivation.
Very
But what
much.
I've found is that, if you're strong in one and your second strength is in another, then you tend to be weak in the other two, or at least
Mhm.
one of the other two. So, and knowing that can really help you to staff to your weakness,
Right.
also lean into your strengths
Hmm.
and be okay with the kind of leader that you are. So
Yeah.
let's talk about that. The first kind of leader that you had you actually began kind of sharing it when you were talking about Barnabas, I think, is the relational shepherd.
Right.
So talk about that.
Yeah. A relational shepherd, and you and I both have different outlines that are really very similar. They just use some different terminology from the material I've used over the years. We call that type of leader the community oriented leader
Okay.
because they're very mindful of relationships. And a community oriented leader just flat loves people and loves to do counseling, loves to do hospital visits, just thrives on that. And they're really kind of drawn to the church member that is the weakest or is going through the greatest crisis. That real shepherding, to be with them in trouble and things of that nature. And they would value, like for a lot of their sermons, for example, would be about love one another,
Right.
about fellowship. They would really emphasize hospitality, making people feel welcome, building bridges. Maybe their favorite scripture would be something like, they all continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, in fellowship, and the
Yes.
breaking
Yes.
of bread. They're
Yeah.
just very relationships are the epitome for them. Strife would break their heart. Where
Yeah.
there's other leaders that if there's strife, they just say, "Get out of here."
Yeah. They
You
thrive on it. Some people are like, okay, what? Yeah. I think that's really true. I would say they're masters of caring for people almost
Mhm.
intuitively. If there is somebody in the church that is hurting, they intuitively sense it. They know it. They will be the person who'll write the little note or make the phone call or do the visit. And this is actually kind of the classic pastoral style. I
It
mean,
really is. Yeah.
really, when ministers were trained in the care of people, the care of the sheep, and counseling, sitting down one on one, listening to their needs, affirming them, and then helping to guide them towards a solution that works.
Mhm.
These are the ones that weep with those who weep and laugh with those who laugh. They love to they love to be invited to someone's house for dinner and minister to them. Uh, I think about this because my parents were this kind of shepherd. They were people shepherds, and I saw them even growing up in my home in the church that we were a part of. They were the care pastors,
Mhm.
and they would just constantly be writing little notes, making phone calls, checking up on somebody, having breakfast. We had kind of an open door house. So people would, if they were in crisis, they would just drive up the driveway on Carter Drive, come
Mhm.
to our house and sit on the porch. And my mom would minister to the ladies. My dad would, encourage or correct the men. My dad was strong. Um, and I knew when our church began to grow, I knew enough to hire them and to put them in place as care pastors
Yeah.
because no matter how large the church grew, they tended to just network and make relationships and help heal broken things in the
Yeah.
church.
And John, I think that brings up a really good thought. And let me know what you think of this, that people who are strongly relational oriented don't always serve in senior leadership roles. many times they serve in supportive roles.
I
I
agree.
had a very strong visionary, mission driven pastor one time tell me, he said, I'm not very good at pastoral care. I don't do good in a hospital room because I'm too intense. I'm wound too tight. And I don't do very good in counseling because, just the way this guy was wired, he said, I don't want to listen to people really. I don't have the patience, and they start to tell me a problem, and I just interrupt them and tell them, well, you need to do this. And he said, I end up offending everybody
Hmm.
because I'm just too intense. Now, this guy was great to motivate a large congregation and
Right.
things like that. But he said to his staff, he said, I need some of you that have gentle personalities. I need some of you that are really patient. And so I think, sometimes we use the word pastor and everybody always thinks senior pastor, the
Right.
overseer of an entire congregation. But I think there's a pastoral function that doesn't necessarily require somebody to be the senior leader. What do you think
Right.
about that?
I think that's true. And, there's all different kinds of churches. So a lot of churches can only afford one pastor.
Right.
And so that pastor, and that's been the traditional, I mean, that's most
Mhm.
common, right? And that pastor has to be kind of everything.
Yeah.
But I find that in those churches, if you if you don't have some pastoral skill or ability, uh, you're going to suffer because the sheep need to know. This is the part of the scripture where Jesus, as our great shepherd, says, "I know my sheep by name, and I call them out." He
Hmm.
knows us. You can only know somebody by spending time with them.
Yeah.
Jesus wasn't just the kind of shepherd that was just leading to the next hill, although he did, but he also took time to build relational community and intimate connection.
Hmm.
There's a great pastor friend of mine. He pastors a church of several thousand people with multiple campuses in another state. I won't say his name because I don't have his permission to share his story, but very effective, visionary, motivational, and organizational leader. Those were his two styles. He was excellent at them. But when it came to any kind of pastoral concern, if somebody had an issue, he'd be like, "Straighten up, get over it." He'd give them teaching or a word or a message, and then if they didn't change, he was like, "I don't have any," he was just, "What's wrong with you?" And his approach to people was getting in the way of his blessing. And what I love about this pastor is that some of his elders sat down with him and told him that his manner was hurtful to them. They loved his teaching, they loved him, they loved his vision and his leadership skills, but that he was a little blind when it came to people's feelings. And what this pastor did is he actually sat down with an executive coach who worked with him to help him become intuitively sensitive. He went to counseling himself to kind of look at that part of him that maybe was disregarding unintentionally people's feelings. And then he actually learned skills and he brought those skills into the pulpit. So when he was preaching, he actually had a couple of pastoral coaches listen to his preaching and say, "Listen, you need to have more personal stories in there. You need some examples. You need to share some of your failures."
Hmm.
And it was hard for him, but he
Hmm.
made the adjustments and his ministry grew to a whole new level.
Yeah.
Even though he wasn't relational by nature, he developed some of those skills and they'll never be first nature to him, but he's
Hmm.
got them and it made him more effective. So I think
Yeah.
that's important. Every pastor needs to either have intuitively or develop some relational skills with
Very much.
people.
John, what you're sharing reminds me of something I heard one time, that every pastor, every human being, and this is a term I use in one of my books called In Search of Timothy, but I say that every leader is deficient by design. In other words, God deliberately did not give any one leader
All of it.
every skill, every gift,
So
every
true.
aptitude, every propensity, every anointing, that we have the Spirit by measure. John the Baptist said, or John the Apostle, one of the two said, that Jesus has the Spirit without measure. But we all have gifts differing according to the
To the
grace.
grace given to us, right?
So none of us are the complete package.
Yeah.
If we were the complete package, had nothing but strengths all across the board, then number one, we'd get into pride. We wouldn't think we needed even God's help. We wouldn't think we needed anybody else's help. We're all deficient by design, and we don't need to feel inferior about that. But someone once said that there are three things you can do when you recognize a deficiency in your life, a weakness. And boy, if we don't recognize what our weaknesses are, um, then we're kind of dangerous because we think we're okay in a leadership area and we're not. We're like that guy doing more harm than help. And number one, we can ignore our weaknesses. We can just keep going on, keep being inefficient, perhaps hurtful. Number one, we can ignore our weaknesses. Number two, we can staff to our weakness. In other words, that
Yeah.
guy could say, okay, I'm insensitive, so I'm going to surround myself with a bunch of sensitive, caring people and let them do all that stuff. Well, yeah, there's some degree to which sometimes we do want to staff to our weaknesses. Number
Certainly.
three, which is what your friend did, was we can grow to our weaknesses.
Yeah.
We can humble ourselves and realize I don't have everything, and there's some areas I need to grow in. And really, there's a fourth way that we can address a weakness. We can do a combination of two and three. We
Mm,
can staff some to our weakness. We can also seek to grow to our weakness. And so
that's excellent.
we have to decide, are we humble enough to admit that, I'm not excellent at everything and I do need people that are better than me. And, like for example, a pastor who's hyper inspirational, but not very organizational. They need some organizational people around them.
It's very true. That's excellent. Let's talk about a second kind of pastor, and this is something you and I discussed a little bit. I call it the visionary, cause motivated shepherd.
Mhm.
Uh, this is the shepherd who is full of dreams. They inspire people to dream big, to think outside the box, to believe God for answered prayer, for miracles. They have kind of this ideal image of what their church should become and could become. And they tirelessly preach that image to the church until it gets into the hearts of the people.
Mhm.
They look at their ministry often in terms of the future, where that caring shepherd, that feeding shepherd, or I'm sorry, that
Nurture.
relational shepherd is really just kind of focusing on caring for the people they have right now. And this guy's always thinking, or per woman, about what's next and how can we build this. They're
Mhm.
optimistic, they inspire, they tend to be resilient, they can be emotional, uh, but they're most fulfilled when people catch the vision that they're sharing and they start walking it out.
Mhm.
That's what lights their fire. Where the relational pastor is most fulfilled when something they've done to care for the sheep, they've counseled them, they've sat with them, has made a difference in their life. They see
Mhm.
the people uh, healthier, blessed because of their personal care. This guy is going to get pumped when he sees them catch the vision and start organizing to make it happen. And
Exactly.
now talk about your how you see this role, this kind of pastor.
I've seen, there's a number of pastors, and let me just say this, Pastor John, and what I'm about to say is not absolute. There, all these, we're sharing a lot of general principles,
Very
but
true.
there's all these nuances and there's exceptions here and there. But typically, a pastor who is predominantly relationship oriented will not have an extremely large church. They will not pastor a mega church because to them the closeness and the tightness, they don't really want, they might say I want more people, but in reality they want a church where they can touch everybody.
Right.
The mission oriented pastor, that the first pastor, the relationship, I call the community oriented pastor, because everything's about community, brother, sister. They see the church as a family.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
the pastor you're describing now, the cause oriented pastor or the mission oriented pastor, he sees the church more as an army. It's more, he may love people, but it's almost more of a utilitarian
Yeah.
type of view. They
We
look
exist for the mission. Yeah.
Yeah, they look at people. And so, for example, the community oriented pastor, his attention will be drawn to the most hurting, where
Uh,
he can pour that oil and wine in. The cause oriented pastor is really drawn to the most committed, the person that will storm the next
yeah.
fort with him, the person that will, take the next mountain with him. He sees the church more as an army. And if you're wounded, okay, get out of the way. Next, let's get somebody else in here who can pick up the rifle and, continue the charge, that type of thing. Their favorite.
Larger than life. They love to speak.
Oh
They
yeah.
love to be in front of people.
Hmm.
Whereas
Yeah.
maybe the relational pastor doesn't feel like he's got to be in front of everybody all the time. He wants interaction with the congregation
Yeah.
on a personal level, right?
Yeah. They say, I don't know if this is true or folklore, but they said that when Alexander the Great had conquered the known world, that he sat down and wept because there were no more people to
Yeah,
conquer, you know?
exactly. My life is over. I have nothing else no
Yeah.
more mission. Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't that
And,
something?
and, and even
And
secularly,
he
John, there
died
are
shortly
leaders.
after that. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
he died very young. Yeah,
Yeah.
33, 34, something like that.
Yeah.
But even people who have been, for example, great wartime leaders, um, like a Winston Churchill or an Abraham Lincoln. And I'm not intelligent enough to address this. I'm not a political scientist, but I believe the consensus is that some people who are great wartime leaders, they don't know how to shift into a non-fighting mode. They don't know how to, really lead just during peace. It's almost like they're driven by that adrenaline of the next
Hmm.
battle.
I'm
And that,
reminded of a quote from The Godfather when Michael Corleone told Tom Hagen, the concierge, he said, "You're not a wartime concierge, Tom. We need a wartime concierge. You're a
yeah,
peacetime." Some people just aren't wartime. That's just not their
yeah,
deal. They're more conciliators. Solomon wasn't a wartime king. He was a peacetime king. He
mm,
made peace. He made covenants. David was a warrior.
yeah,
He was a fighter and a conqueror, and they're very different personalities.
yeah. And there was blood on David's sword, and that limited what he could do.
That's right.
John, the one thing that has troubled me over the years is that, especially with younger pastors, is that they look at other people and they look at other people's TV programs or podcasts or books or whatever, and they just end up feeling so inferior because they're not like them.
Yeah.
And they feel like, well, I've got to imitate them. And to me, that's sure we can learn from other people, but ultimately, every pastor, every leader has their own God given uh, DNA.
Yeah.
They're wired a certain way. And every leader should be endeavoring to be the best them that they can be,
Right.
not try to be. The first time, John, I just barely been spirit filled. I was 18 or 19 years old, and I was invited to speak at a coffee house, and it was just this little testimony and that type of thing. And I'd seen Billy Graham give altar calls and on television, and so I give an altar call like Billy Graham, and I even stood like Billy Graham. I'd seen him stand
Sure.
and all that. And it's just a flop. And because I was trying to imitate somebody else.
Yeah.
And there's such a huge difference between inspiration and imitation.
Mm.
And if people are trying to imitate other leaders, If you have the same kind of calling, you might be able to do some of the things they do. But if you're wired totally different and you're trying to be something that you're not,
Yeah.
it's probably going to be really frustrating and it's not going to end well.